The planner called at 2:17 in the afternoon. "Your family requested we remove you from the guest list," she said, her voice chillingly polite. No argument, no scandal. I was simply erased. But 4 days later, I uncovered the real reason. They did not just want me out of my sister's wedding photos. They needed me gone long enough to quietly steal my legal power to stop a buyout that would swallow our grandmother's estate whole. My name is Valeria Hollister. I am 36 years old, and I make my living looking for the fractures other people try to conceal. As a senior title risk analyst at Crescent Harbor Title Group in Richmond, Virginia, my days are spent buried in deeds, liens, easements, and zoning variances. I am the person who finds the forgotten right-of-way from 1942, the undisclosed boundary dispute hiding behind a neighbor's fence line, the quiet, structural rot in a seemingly perfect multi-million-dollar real estate contract. I am sharp. I am calm. I am deeply accustomed to spotting the fatal flaw in the paperwork long before anyone else realizes the entire house is built on sand. Perhaps that professional hazard is why I never saw the collapse coming in my own family. Or perhaps I did see it, and I simply chose to look the other way, trusting blood over ink. My family lives an hour and a half west of me, nestled in the affluent, rolling, tree-lined suburbs just outside Charlottesville. My father, Graham Hollister, and my mother, Elise, have spent decades cultivating the perfect, impenetrable veneer to any outsider looking in. We are the quintessential model of the modern, refined Southern family. We have the sprawling brick colonial house, the meticulously manicured boxwoods that my mother obsesses over, the generational ties to the Virginia soil, and then there is my younger sister, Lila. From the time we were children, the roles in the Hollister household were rigidly, if silently, assigned and enforced. I was the reliable one. I brought home exceptional grades. I never caused a scene in public. And if a problem arose, whether it was a broken bicycle chain or a complicated college application, I solved it myself. I was the sturdy foundation, the load-bearing wall of the family dynamic. Lila, on the other hand, was the stained glass window. She drew every eye the moment she walked into a room. She was soft, effortlessly charming, and possessed that rare, magnetic vulnerability that made people, especially our parents, scramble to protect her from the harsh edges of the world. If Lila dropped a water glass in the kitchen, the family rushed in, panicked, to ensure she had not cut her delicate skin. If I dropped one, I was expected to have the broom and dustpan in hand, sweeping in silence, before the shards even stopped spinning on the linoleum. For many years, I never called this dynamic out. I never named the glaring unfairness of it. I rationalized the disparity in how we were treated. I told myself that the more mature person ought to yield. I had my independence, my quiet apartment in Richmond, and a rigorous, demanding career I had built entirely on my own merit. I did not need to be coddled. I did not need applause for simply functioning as a capable adult. This unspoken arrangement solidified permanently when our grandmother passed away, while my parents and Lila were paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of grief. Sitting in the formal parlor with tear-stained faces, receiving casseroles and endless condolences from neighbors, I was the one sitting in sterile, fluorescent-lit conference rooms with estate attorneys. I was the one who gathered the messy, disorganized files spanning 50 years. I ordered the death certificates. I closed the bank accounts, routed the utilities, and handled the dizzying mountain of legal paperwork regarding the crown jewel of our family, Hollister Orchard House. It was a sprawling, breathtakingly beautiful piece of legacy property, and securing its title, transferring the trust, and paying the estate taxes took 8 months of grueling bureaucratic navigation. My family was perfectly content to let me carry the heavy load. They thanked me, of course, but it was the kind of polite, distant thanks you give a highly efficient employee after a long quarter, not the profound gratitude you owe a grieving daughter who sacrificed her own time to mourn. Then came Everett Dane, Lila's engagement to Everett was not merely a joyous announcement. It was a seismic shift in our family's entire center of gravity. Everett was the golden scion of a phenomenally wealthy, deeply entrenched family from the Washington District of Columbia and Northern Virginia corridor. The Danes had made their vast fortune in luxury real estate and currently managed an elite portfolio of high-end boutique properties under the corporate umbrella of Dane Lantern Hospitality. From the exact moment Everett slipped a flawless, 3-carat diamond ring onto Lila's finger, my parents began behaving as though we were marrying into British royalty. The wedding planning consumed them entirely. Every phone call with my mother devolved instantly into a frantic, breathless monologue about imported silk table linens, Michelin-starred catering menus, and curating the absolute perfect list of very important people. My father, usually a quiet, reserved man who preferred golf over networking, suddenly started dropping the names of heavy-hitting corporate sponsors, senators, and lobbyist friends that Everett's family knew. He spoke endlessly, almost obsessively, about the doors this union would open, the unprecedented social and financial opportunities for the entire Hollister family. There was a feverish, desperate hunger in their sudden obsession that made the back of my neck prickle with unease. It did not feel like a mother and father preparing for a celebration of love. It felt terribly like a corporate board preparing for a hostile merger. The true, cold nature of this merger revealed itself to me during the official pre-engagement dinner. It was held at a shockingly expensive, exclusive French restaurant tucked away in Georgetown. The private dining room they had reserved was suffocatingly intimate, draped in heavy crimson velvet and smelling faintly of white truffles, expensive gin, and old money. Everett's parents, Richard and Corinne Dane, held court at the head of the long mahogany table like monarchs receiving tributes. Corinne Dane was a woman carved from ice and generational wealth. She wore a perfectly tailored ivory suit that undoubtedly cost more than my first car, and her eyes were a pale, calculating, unblinking blue. Throughout the first 2 courses of the dinner, she barely acknowledged my existence. I was simply the older, unmarried, slightly too serious sister, a bland, necessary footnote to Lila's radiant, bubbling main character energy. But halfway through the roasted duck course, Corinne deliberately turned her gaze down the table and locked her eyes on me. "So, Valeria," Corinne said, her voice cutting clearly and sharply through the polite, low hum of the room. "Elise tells me you handle property titles. Real estate risk analysis." "Yes," I replied, sitting up slightly straighter, keeping my tone perfectly level. "I am a senior analyst at Crescent Harbor. We mostly deal with commercial title insurance, large-scale acquisitions, and complex defect resolution." I fully expected her to nod politely, feign a momentary interest, and pivot right back to discussing the imported floral arrangements for the reception. Instead, she leaned forward, completely dismissing the reality of my career, and zeroed in on the only thing she actually cared about. "Fascinating. And regarding your grandmother's property, the Orchard House," she began, taking a slow, measured sip of her dark Cabernet, "are the title deeds entirely clear? I imagine a property of that significant age in the Charlottesville area must have some incredibly convoluted zoning histories. Has it been formally evaluated for its commercial exploitation potential?" The entire table went dead silent for a fraction of a second. The clinking of silverware stopped. My mother offered a tight, incredibly nervous laugh, glancing frantically between me and Corinne. "Oh, Corinne, let us not bore the girls with dry real estate talk tonight," my mother said, her voice trembling just slightly. "I am not bored at all, Elise," Corinne replied, her pale eyes never leaving my face. "It is a magnificent piece of land. It would be an absolute tragedy to let it sit there growing apples year after year when it could be doing so much more for everyone. You do have the trust documentation completely digitized and accessible. Valeria." I looked back at Corinne. I did not see a future mother-in-law trying to make clumsy but polite dinner conversation. I saw exactly what I saw every single day at Crescent Harbor when a ruthless developer was circling a vulnerable, underutilized piece of land, It was not the warm, welcoming gaze of someone embracing a new family member. It was the sharp, clinical, merciless stare of an appraiser evaluating an asset for liquidation. "The estate is perfectly secure, Mrs. Dane," I said, my voice deliberately flat, giving her absolutely nothing to work with. "And its current zoning is strictly agricultural and residential. We intend to keep it exactly that way." Corinne offered a tight smile that did not even come close to reaching her eyes. "Of course, dear. But things just have a way of evolving over time. Do they not?" She abruptly turned her attention back to Lila, loudly praising the elegant cut of her designer dress, and the suffocating tension in the room slowly dissipated back into the meaningless clinking of crystal glasses and silver forks. But my appetite was completely gone. The instinct that made me exceptionally good at my job. The quiet, internal alarm bell that rings when a signature is slightly off, when a critical date is smudged, when an escape clause is hidden far too deep in a seemingly standard addendum, was now screaming in my ears. I looked down the table at my father, who was nodding eagerly, almost submissively, at something Richard Dane was saying about golf courses. I looked at my mother, who was beaming at Corinne with an expression that bordered on pure sycophancy. And finally, I looked at Lila, radiant, completely oblivious to the undercurrents, playing her part of the beautiful prize to absolute perfection. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cold, hard reality of the situation settle deep into my bones. They were not just planning a grand wedding. They were actively staging a massive, life-altering transaction. And I realized, with a sickening pit in my stomach, that I was the only person sitting at that table actually reading the fine print. The wedding was officially scheduled for the second week of October. But the invasive, frenetic construction at Hollister Orchard House began in late May. It made absolutely no logical sense. We were not even hosting the actual ceremony or the reception on our property. My parents had already secured an exorbitantly priced, historic private estate closer to the city for the main events. Yet, our family orchard was suddenly crawling with high-end contractors and landscape architects. They were ruthlessly ripping out the old, hand-carved mahogany banisters in the main hallway, replacing the perfectly functional slate patio with imported white marble, and tearing down the original glass greenhouse where my grandmother used to cultivate heirloom tomatoes. The official excuse my mother gave, repeated constantly like a desperately memorized mantra, was that we needed a proper elevated place for our extended relatives to gather before the main event. But as a title and risk analyst, I know exactly what structural, commercial-grade upgrades look like. You do not pour tens of thousands of dollars into industrial-capacity electrical panels, widened driveway turnarounds, and commercial landscaping just so Aunt Martha has a picturesque spot to sip sweet tea on a Friday afternoon. When I questioned the sheer, reckless scale of the expenditures, Lila just tossed her glossy hair over her shoulder and offered a serene, vacant smile. "Everett wants to build a life for me that is on the right level, Val," she said, using that soft, patronizing tone she reserved for people who simply did not understand the necessities of high society. My mother, Elise, was even more direct, her eyes flashing with a frantic, uncharacteristic ambition. "Connecting with the Dane family is going to change the future of this entire family. Valeria, you have to spend money to show you belong in the room. This is an investment in where we are going." It was a suffocating, exhausting performance of class. They were hemorrhaging cash. They did not have to prove to billionaires that we were not just humble, provincial farmers holding on to a patch of dirt. Orchestrating this entire circus from the shadows was Corinne Dane. She did not merely offer motherly suggestions. She issued absolute edicts. She dictated the vintage of the rehearsal dinner champagne, the precise, custom shade of ivory for the floral arrangements, and most alarmingly, the structure of the guest list. I noticed she had commandeered 3 entire tables near the front of the reception layout, designating them not for lifelong family friends, but strictly for investors and key corporate stakeholders. She even managed the photography shot list, subtly but firmly deciding who should and should not appear in the intimate family portraits. She instructed the lead photographer to prioritize wide, sweeping shots that captured the scale of the venues, explicitly telling them to minimize candid shots of the Hollister side unless Everett was standing in the direct center of the frame. Whenever I was in the room, Corinne's pale blue eyes would slide right past me, categorizing me as a logistical error she had yet to correct, because I was the reliable daughter who understood paperwork. My father casually dropped a thick stack of vendor contracts on my lap one Sunday afternoon. Just give these a quick glance to make sure the lighting and valet companies are not sneaking in any hidden service fees. He chuckled nervously, avoiding my eyes. I sat at the kitchen island with a mug of black coffee and flipped through the dense catering agreements, the tent rentals, and the liability waivers, but tucked near the very back, completely out of place and printed on a different weight of paper, was a misfiled document. It was a formal addendum for a feasibility review. My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, my professional instincts flaring to life. It was not a contract for wedding uplighting. It was a preliminary architectural and zoning assessment for converting the agricultural acreage of Hollister Orchard House into a high-end, luxury commercial retreat. "Lila," I called out, holding the paper up as she walked into the kitchen holding a stack of silk fabric swatches. "What exactly is this feasibility addendum? This has absolutely nothing to do with floral arrangements or valet parking." Lila's eyes widened in sudden panic, and she practically lunged across the marble island. Snatching the pages aggressively from my hand, she forced a high, brittle, entirely unconvincing laugh. "Oh, that is nothing, Val. Just a silly future idea Everett's development team was playing around with for down the line. It has absolutely nothing to do with the wedding weekend. Do not be so paranoid and dramatic." She shoved the crumpled papers deep into her designer tote bag and practically ran out of the room before I could say another word. The paranoia she accused me of was entirely justified. Later that same week, I overheard my father pacing in his dark mahogany study, speaking in hushed, incredibly strained tones on his telephone. When I walked in, he slammed the receiver down onto the cradle as if it had burned him. I asked him point blank how we were affording the imported marble, the new roof, and the endless stream of contractor invoices. He refused to meet my gaze, staring instead at his leather desk blotter, muttering vaguely about securing a short-term line of credit to smooth out the cash flow for the wedding season. When I pressed him for the actual hard figures, the specific interest rates, and what exactly he had put up as collateral, his jaw hardened, and he flatly refused to answer. As someone who spends her life analyzing financial risk and tracing hidden liabilities, I knew the distinct smell of a drowning man. My parents were quietly taking on catastrophic debt, likely leveraging the only tangible asset our family owned, all for a single weekend of blinding pageantry. The disparate pieces finally began to lock into a terrifying, cohesive picture on a Tuesday morning. My office inbox chimed with an email forwarded directly from Marin Pike, the elite wedding planner. It was clearly a careless administrative mistake, intended only for my mother and Corinne Dane. The subject line read, "Finalized schedule update." I scrolled past the rehearsal dinner timings and the bridal makeup schedules, stopping dead at a block scheduled for the Monday morning immediately following the wedding ceremony. It was boldly labeled Monday Investor Brunch and Site Walkthrough. A normal, loving family wedding does not conclude with a catered brunch explicitly designated for private equity investors and commercial land consultants. I decided to test the waters, to see how deep the rot actually went, during the final dress fitting that afternoon. While Corinne was critically evaluating the French lace on Lila's veil, I casually brought it up. "I saw a brief mention of a site walkthrough on the schedule for Monday morning," I said smoothly, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. "Will the Hollister family be expected to attend that, or is it strictly for the groomsmen?" Corinne whipped her head around. The mask of polite, high society grace vanished entirely for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flash of genuine, venomous annoyance. "That is corporate business, Valeria," she snapped, her voice hitting the air like cracking ice. "It does not concern the bridal party or the extended family. You really ask far too many specific, intrusive questions for someone who is merely a guest." Her harsh reaction confirmed every suspicion I held. My presence, my questions, my sheer ability to comprehend a legal document without being blinded by the glare of the Dane family fortune. I was an active, breathing threat to the perfect, compliant picture they were desperately trying to paint. The final fatal fracture happened on a Thursday evening, just over a week before the wedding. An automated email hit my personal inbox via a secure encrypted document signing platform. The sender was technically listed as my father's estate attorney, but the request clearly originated from Corinne's legal team. The document was vaguely titled, "Standard Family Confirmation of Asset Authority." I read the 3 pages meticulously. It was intentionally vague, riddled with circular, obfuscating language, but its core legal function was undeniable. It asked me to formally waive my right to contest any imminent financial restructuring of the Hollister Trust during the month of October. They were trying to blindfold me legally, binding my hands before the wedding vows were even spoken. I did not call my father to demand an explanation. I did not text Lila to argue. I simply moved my mouse and clicked the bright red button that read "Decline to sign." I typed a single, decisive sentence in the required reasoning box, refused due to overly broad and undefined terms regarding the authorization of the Hollister Trust. I hit send, and I closed my laptop. From that precise second, the very air around me shifted. The frantic, daily family group chats went completely silent. My mother stopped calling me to complain about the caterers. I had drawn a hard, legal line in the sand with my refusal. And rather than step over it to have an honest conversation with me, my family made a different choice. They decided it was much easier to simply erase me from the map. It was a Wednesday afternoon when the axe finally fell. The clock on my dashboard read 2:30. I had just finished a lengthy site visit at a commercial development on the south side of Richmond and was pulling my sedan into the dim, concrete parking garage of my office building. The engine was still running, vibrating softly beneath my hands, when my cell phone illuminated against the passenger seat. The caller identification displayed the name Maren Pike. Maren was the high society wedding planner my mother had hired, a woman whose entire lucrative career was built on manufacturing flawless aesthetic experiences for people who could afford her exorbitant retainers. I answered the call, fully expecting a panicked question about vendor insurance policies or a missing signature on a catering liability waiver. "Valeria," Maren said. Her voice was perfectly modulated, crisp, and chillingly professional. It was the exact tone a corporate human resources director uses to terminate a mid-level employee. Polite, detached, and entirely devoid of human empathy. "I am calling to inform you of a necessary administrative update regarding the events of next weekend." "Go ahead, Maren," I replied, shifting my car into park. "There has been a restructuring of the seating arrangements and the overall capacity limits for the primary venues," she continued smoothly, not a single tremor of hesitation in her breath. "At the direct request of your family, your name has been removed from the finalized guest list." I stopped breathing. My hand tightened involuntarily around the thick leather wrap of the steering wheel. I waited for her to clarify, to laugh, to tell me there was a clerical error regarding the bridal party seating chart. But the silence stretched over the cellular connection, thick and heavy. "Removed," I repeated. The word tasted dry and metallic in my mouth. "Yes," Maren confirmed without missing a single beat. "Furthermore, I need to let you know that your reservation at the boutique hotel block has been officially canceled, and your name has been permanently taken off the roster for the private shuttle service. The security team at the main estate has also been provided with an updated access list to avoid any unfortunate misunderstandings on the day of the event." Security. They had explicitly warned the hired security guards about me. "I see," I managed to say. My voice did not shake. The rigorous training of a decade spent keeping my composure in hostile, high-stakes boardrooms kicked in, locking my vocal cords firmly into place. "Thank you for the update, Marin, goodbye. I ended the call. I did not scream. I did not smash my phone against the dashboard. I simply sat there. I sat dead still in the quiet, artificially lit parking garage for nearly 50 minutes. The engine hummed beneath me until the automatic shutoff triggered, plunging the cabin of my car into heavy, suffocating silence. I stared straight ahead at the concrete pillar parked right in front of my bumper. I noticed a small, jagged crack running down its center. I traced the path of that crack with my eyes, over and over again. I felt the slow, creeping chill of the air conditioning drying the sudden, cold sweat on my forehead. I noticed the faint, stale smell of old coffee and vanilla air freshener trapped in the upholstery. These tiny, entirely insignificant physical details anchored me to the physical earth, while the entire foundation of my identity was being quietly dismantled. The most agonizing part of the betrayal was not the loss of a party invitation or a designer dress. It was the sheer, breathtaking sterility of the execution. I had not been cast out in a fiery, emotional shouting match. There had been no tearful confrontations, no slammed doors, no passionate declarations of anger in the family living room. I had been quietly, efficiently deleted. My family had treated my existence like a faulty, inconvenient clause in a real estate contract, highlighting my name and pressing the backspace key. I was a logistical error they had corrected through a third-party vendor. My first, deeply ingrained instinct was to fix it. My hand hovered over my phone. I could easily call Lila and demand an explanation. I could call my father and force him to speak to me like a man. I could put my car in reverse, drive straight to Charlottesville, walk through the front door of the Orchard House, and start a terrifying war. For 36 years, my designated role had been the fixer. When the family machinery broke down, I was the one who rolled up my sleeves, swallowed my pride, and repaired the gears. But as I sat in the dim quiet of my car, a profound, bone-deep exhaustion washed over me. For the first time in my entire life, I did not want to clean up their mess. I did not want to fight for a seat at a table where I was fundamentally unwanted. If they wanted me gone, I would give them exactly what they asked for. I unbuckled my seatbelt, grabbed my leather briefcase, and walked toward the elevators without looking back. That evening, my apartment was entirely dark except for the small, warm lamp glowing on the kitchen counter. I was sitting on a wooden bar stool, staring blankly at the grain of the wood. When the deadbolt clicked open, Mara Keene let herself in. Mara and I had been absolute best friends since our first year of undergraduate studies. She was a probate litigator, a sharp, unyielding woman who spent her days navigating the toxic, money-fueled wreckage of broken families and contested wills. She walked in carrying 2 large brown paper bags that smelled sharply of garlic, basil, and roasted duck from our favorite Thai restaurant down the street. She took one look at my face in the dim light, stopped dead in her tracks, and set the bags down on the floor. She did not bother with pleasantries. She did not ask how my day was. "What happened?" she demanded, crossing the room and pulling out the stool next to mine. I told her. I relayed the brief phone call with Marin Pike exactly as it had occurred, repeating the sterile, corporate phrasing verbatim. I told her about the hotel cancellation, the shuttle list, and the security update. I kept my voice entirely flat, presenting the grim facts to her exactly like a legal case file. When I finished, Mara did not gasp in shock. She did not offer hollow, comforting platitudes. She did not suggest that my mother was simply stressed about the caterers and had made a terrible, temporary mistake. Mara dealt with the darkest, greediest corners of human nature every single day of her professional life. She profoundly understood the weaponization of paperwork. She leaned her elbows on the counter, steepling her fingers together, and looked at me with dark, calculating eyes. "People do not hire security guards to keep out a sister because of a minor family argument over floral arrangements, Valeria," Mara said, her voice low, steady, and sharp. "They do not orchestrate a systemic, administrative blackout just because you asked an annoying question about the catering budget." She paused, letting the heavy silence hang in the air between us. What do they need you to disappear for? That specific question hit me with the physical force of a blow to the chest. It bypassed the raw, bleeding emotional wound of being rejected by my parents and struck the cold, highly analytical center of my brain. Mara was absolutely right. The sheer scale and precision of the exclusion was entirely disproportionate to any perceived social offense I could have possibly committed. They were not just removing me from the polished photographs. They were geographically isolating me from the family, the property, and the entire wedding weekend. They needed me away from the documents. They needed me far away from the investors. The next 3 days were a masterclass in psychological torture. Wednesday bled into Thursday. Thursday faded into Friday. And Friday dragged agonizingly into Saturday. I went to work. I reviewed title policies. I drank my black coffee. And I waited. I kept my phone sitting face up on my desk, on my kitchen counter, on my nightstand. Every single time the screen illuminated with a junk email or a meaningless calendar reminder. My heart slammed violently against my ribs. I was waiting for the frantic apology. I was waiting for the panicked phone call from my father claiming Marin had severely overstepped her professional bounds. I was waiting for Lila to text me, crying, begging me to come back because she could not possibly get married without her older sister standing nearby. Nothing came. Not a single call, not a single text message, not a forwarded email. The silence was infinitely more violent than the phone call from Marin Pike had been. The phone call was an action. The silence was a deliberate, continuous choice. Every hour that ticked by was an hour in which my mother, my father, and my sister actively decided that they were perfectly fine with my absence. They were eating rehearsal dinners together. They were attending final dress fittings. They were laughing warmly with Corinne Dane. And they were doing it all while fully knowing I was sitting alone in Richmond, surgically excised from their lives. By Sunday evening, the desperate, hollow ache in my chest had hardened into something else entirely. It calcified. It turned into something sharp, cold, and exquisitely focused. The grief was certainly still there, but it was now locked securely behind a heavy steel wall of pure, unadulterated clarity. I picked up my phone. I opened my message thread with Lila. The last message was a trivial picture she had sent a week ago of a pair of designer shoes. I stared at the bright screen for a long time. I did not want to write a long, highly emotional paragraph. I did not want to beg for a profound realization. And I certainly did not want to threaten her. I simply wanted to hand her the rope and watch closely to see what she chose to do with it. I typed carefully, making sure my grammar was perfect, my tone deeply polite and entirely composed. I was giving my younger sister one final, closing window to be family instead of a corporate pawn. Lila, I received a phone call from Marin Pike regarding the guest list. I am giving you the opportunity to explain this to me directly before I draw my own conclusions. I hit send. I placed the phone face down on the wooden table, and then, for the first time in 5 days, I finally exhaled. It took exactly 7 hours for my phone to vibrate with a response from Lila. The screen illuminated the dark kitchen counter, casting a harsh, artificial glow across the wood grain. I did not pick the device up immediately. I let it sit there, staring at the notification badge, bracing myself for whatever emotional manipulation was waiting inside. When I finally opened the message, the words were so sterile they practically smelled of bleach. Val. The message read, "We had to restructure the guest list. Everett's side of the family had several crucial, last-minute additions, and the venue has incredibly strict fire codes. I am so sorry, but please do not make things harder right now." I read the text message 3 times. Restructure the guest list. It was such an aggressively corporate phrasing, a stark departure from a sister who historically communicated almost entirely in exclamation points and effusive emojis. It sounded exactly like a press release drafted by Corinne Dane's public relations team. But it was the final sentence that truly anchored the knife in my ribs. Please do not make things harder right now. That single, polite phrase stripped away every lingering illusion I held about a simple misunderstanding. Lila was not agonizing over seeding charts. She was not a victim of circumstance, helplessly caught between two warring families. She knew exactly what was happening, and she had made a conscious, calculated choice. Do not make things harder was not a plea for peace. It was a firm, undeniable instruction from a person who had chosen her side of the battlefield and was asking the enemy to surrender quietly. She did not want me to fight for my place in the family because my presence was the very thing making her new life difficult. The absolute confirmation of their deceit arrived the following morning, delivered by an unexpected source. My phone rang shortly after 9 o'clock. The caller identification showed the name Reed Hollister. Reed was my younger cousin, a 22-year-old film student who had been roped into operating the secondary cameras for the massive wedding videography crew. He was a quiet, observant kid who usually blended right into the wallpaper at family gatherings. "Valeria," Reed said. His voice hushed and hurried over the line. In the background, I could hear the distinct, chaotic sounds of heavy equipment being moved and event coordinators shouting instructions. "Why are you not at the morning walkthrough? Aunt Elise told everyone you had a sudden work emergency." "I'm not attending the wedding, Reed," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly even. I was informed the guest list had to be downsized due to venue capacity limits and fire codes. A short, sharp bark of laughter echoed through the phone. It was completely devoid of humor. "Capacity limits," Reed echoed, his voice dropping even lower, practically down to a whisper. "Valeria, that is a complete lie. I literally just looked at the master catering manifest taped to the kitchen door. They are under the minimum guarantee by at least 40 plates. They actually had to space the tables further apart just to make the ballroom look full. There is absolutely no space issue." I closed my eyes, pressing 2 fingers against the bridge of my nose. The lie was so thin, so insultingly fragile, that they had not even bothered to make it mathematically plausible. "There is something else," Reed continued, the nervous energy radiating through the cellular connection. "I was running audio cables near the bridal suite yesterday afternoon. The door was cracked open. Corinne Dane was in there with your parents. I was not trying to eavesdrop, but Corinne has that voice that just cuts through walls." "What did she say?" "Reed," I asked, my blood suddenly running cold. "She was talking about Monday morning," he replied. "I heard her say, very clearly, she cannot be in the room when the paperwork starts moving. And then your dad said something about keeping everything contained." "Val, what paperwork? What the hell is going on?" "Thank you, Reed," I said, my voice eerily calm despite the sudden roaring in my ears. "I need to go. Please do not tell anyone you spoke to me." I disconnected the call and dropped the phone onto my desk. "She cannot be in the room when the paperwork starts moving." The sentence echoed violently in the quiet space of my office. It fundamentally altered the entire architecture of the betrayal. This was no longer a story of social exclusion or family favoritism. It was a calculated, heavily orchestrated legal conspiracy. I was not merely an unfashionable sister being hidden in the attic. I was an active, targeted threat to a transaction. I was being forcibly removed because I knew too much. And more importantly, because I knew exactly how to read the fine print. My mind immediately raced back to the suspicious document I had refused to sign the week prior. That vague waiver of authority had been clumsy, an 11th-hour attempt to secure my compliance. But seasoned corporate players like the Dane family rarely rely on a single, flimsy net. If they needed paperwork to move smoothly on Monday, they must have laid the groundwork long before that single email. I opened my laptop and bypassed my primary inbox, diving straight into the deep archives of my deleted and filtered messages. I ran a sweeping Boolean search for any encrypted file sharing services, focusing entirely on messages originating from my father's personal email address over the past 6 months. The progress bar crawled across the screen. Then, a single, buried thread populated the results. It was an automated notification time-stamped at 2:15 in the morning, Exactly 7 weeks ago. It was a request for a digital signature. But the crucial detail was that the request had been manually voided and canceled by the sender a mere 4 minutes after it was generated, long before I had ever woken up to see it. My father had panicked and pulled it back. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the metadata. The canceled attachment bore a chillingly specific title, Hollister Orchard House Intrafamily Asset Restructuring Agreement. They were not just taking out loans. They were fundamentally altering the ownership structure of the land itself. I needed the foundational text. I needed the rules of the game they were trying to rig. I immediately looked up the contact information for the boutique probate law firm in Charlottesville that had settled my grandmother's estate all those years ago. The senior managing partner had long since retired, but the head paralegal, a sharp, fiercely organized woman I had spent months collaborating with, was still there. I called her direct line. I did not offer any dramatic family backstory. I simply identified myself, provided my social security number for verification, and formally requested a digital copy of the master trust summary. Because I was a named, legal beneficiary, she had the encrypted document sitting in my inbox within 2 hours. I downloaded the massive file, the digital weight of my family's entire legacy sitting on my screen. I bypassed the standard definitions and the boilerplate indemnity clauses, scrolling relentlessly until I reached the specific section governing the disposition of the physical real estate. Section 4, Paragraph B, the Asset Preservation Clause. I remembered my grandmother possessing a deep, quiet skepticism regarding my father's financial acumen. She knew he was easily swayed by the illusion of status. I had read this clause years ago, but it's true. Devastating power had never fully registered until this exact moment. The legal language was dense, but to an analyst, it was as clear as glass. The clause explicitly mandated that any sale, transfer of title, refinancing, structural lien, or commercial zoning conversion of Hollister Orchard House required the valid, notarized, and legally sound consent of all living beneficiaries of the subsequent generation. It required the consent of both sisters. I read the paragraph again, and then a third time. The realization washed over me, cold and absolute, crystallizing every bizarre event of the past few months. My signature, the frantic renovations, the secret investor brunches, the canceled digital document, the sudden deployment of security guards, the brutal, surgical removal of my name from the guest list. It all led back to this single paragraph. They could not execute the commercial development with the Dane family without my explicit legal blessing. And they knew, with absolute certainty, that if I saw the genuine terms of the deal, I would never, ever sign it. The shock gave way to a profound, hollow clarity. The family I had spent my entire life protecting was not afraid of my presence ruining the aesthetic perfection of their wedding photographs. They were terrified of my legal authority. They had carefully engineered my absence so that when Monday morning arrived, and the bankers sat down at the table, they could either present a forged authorization or claim some form of emergency proxy, exploiting my physical absence to push the transaction past the point of no return. They had hidden behind a polite, manufactured family conflict to disguise a hostile corporate takeover of my inheritance. And the most terrifying part was that it was working flawlessly. Mara and I sat at my kitchen island until 3 a.m. The harsh, blue glow of our dual laptop monitors was the only light in the apartment, casting long shadows against the walls. We did not speak much. We simply typed, cross-referenced, and pulled public records with the brutal, silent efficiency of a prosecution team building a racketeering case. We started with the Virginia State Corporation Commission database. Mara, operating with the cold precision of a probate litigator who knew exactly where wealthy people hid their dirty laundry, ran a comprehensive search for any new corporate entities registered under Everett's name or his family's broader corporate umbrella over the past 12 months. It took her less than 20 minutes to find the smoking gun. "Look at this," Mara said, turning her screen toward me. Her voice was completely devoid of any inflection, sounding like a detective presenting a murder weapon. The corporate entity had been registered exactly 8 weeks prior. The name on the official state filing was Dane Harvest Retreat, Limited Liability Company. I pulled up the master corporate structure document. Everett was listed as the primary managing member, with his mother, Corinne, sitting on the executive board. But it was the designated foundational asset listed in the preliminary operational filings that made the blood freeze in my veins. The asset securing the company was Hollister Orchard House. The business purpose was explicitly, legally defined as a high-end commercial hospitality redevelopment. The horrific truth settled over the kitchen island. The entire wedding was a sham. It was not a celebration of love. It was a highly orchestrated, incredibly expensive investor pitch. The sudden, frantic renovations, the tearing up of my grandmother's greenhouse, the installation of commercial-grade electrical panels and widened driveways. They were staging the property for the Monday morning walkthrough. They were using my sister in her white lace gown, the imported floral arrangements, and the expensive champagne as a grand theatrical backdrop to secure private equity funding. My parents thought they were hosting a society wedding. The Danes were hosting a corporate acquisition, using our family's emotional vulnerability as the ultimate negotiating leverage. I opened a new tab and logged into the state judicial database. A vital question burned in my mind if the Dane family was as immensely wealthy as they aggressively projected. Why did they need my family's modest agricultural land to secure a new venture? Truly liquid billionaires do not need to cannibalize their future in-laws' estates to launch a countryside resort. I ran a sweeping docket search on Dane Lantern Hospitality across the Fairfax and Loudoun County Circuit Courts. The results populated down the screen, and the grand illusion of the Dane family empire shattered instantly. "They are drowning," I whispered, scrolling rapidly through the active civil litigation dockets. Mara leaned over my shoulder, her eyes tracking the text. 2 active commercial lawsuits for breach of contract, 3 unresolved mechanics liens filed by major construction firms. And look at this summary judgment from 6 months ago for late vendor payments on their flagship property. The truth was staggering, yet entirely predictable to anyone who analyzed corporate risk for a living. The Danes were not rich in the way that actually mattered. They were rich in surface area. They were rich in their ability to wear bespoke Italian suits, lease imported luxury vehicles, and project an aura of total financial invulnerability that made naive people feel incredibly safe. Their actual cash flow and true liquidity were dangerously fragile. They were operating on a razor-thin margin of aggressive debt, and Everett's company desperately needed a tangible, unencumbered, high-value asset to leverage for their next massive bank loan. Our family orchard was that exact asset. My parents had walked right into the slaughterhouse, absolutely mesmerized by the gold-plated business cards and the promise of elite social elevation. I remembered my father nervously mentioning a short-term line of credit. He had not just borrowed a few $1,000s for the rehearsal dinner catering. He had likely pledged his own personal financial assets, perhaps even the remaining equity in his primary residence, to pour hundreds of thousands of dollars into upgrading the orchard property. He genuinely believed he was doing what was necessary to bring our family to a new social stratosphere. In reality, he was blindly financing the very commercial development the Danes were about to steal from him. Then, a sudden, sickening memory hit me with the physical force of a blow to the chest. 4 months ago, my mother had frantically emailed me in the middle of a workday. She claimed the wedding bookkeeper needed to verify my identity for a retroactive vendor insurance policy because I had once co-signed a residential lease for Lila during her sophomore year of college. It made very little sense at the time, but my mother was so stressed and hysterical over the phone. I simply complied to stop her crying. I had sent her a high-resolution scanned document containing my perfectly clear, unrestricted legal signature. "Mara," I said, my voice barely a whisper, the horror creeping up my throat. "They have my signature on file." My mother sent it to their bookkeeper to use as a reference document. Mara's eyes darkened immediately, the litigator in her recognizing the fatal exposure. They are going to forge your consent, or they are going to lift the digital signature file and attach it directly to a proxy authorization, claiming you signed it voluntarily before you conveniently had to miss the wedding weekend due to a sudden work emergency. I thought about my younger sister. I knew Lila was aware of the name of the new company. She had physically snatched the feasibility addendum from my hands in the kitchen. But Lila possessed a dangerous, willful blindness when it came to beautiful things. She likely believed Dane Harvest Retreat was a highly romantic, collaborative gesture. She pictured herself as the elegant hostess and founder of a boutique countryside brand, standing beside Everett in a tailored suit. She was entirely incapable of reading a capitalization table or understanding a corporate vesting schedule. She was willfully ignoring the reality that the Danes would structure the holding company to maintain absolute control, dilute her equity to absolutely nothing within the first year, and leave our family holding the massive renovation debt. The sheer audacity of the betrayal burned away the very last remnants of my grief. I was not removed from the guest list because I was the disappointing, unglamorous older sister who did not fit the aesthetic. I was not erased because I asked annoying logistical questions about the wine selections. I was surgically removed because I was the only person in our entire bloodline who was awake. I was the only one who could look at a massive bouquet of white roses and see the predatory lending terms hiding underneath the delicate petals. My immediate, visceral instinct was to pick up the phone, call my father, and scream the absolute truth into his ear until he woke up from his pathetic, class-obsessed delusion. I wanted to get into my car, drive straight to the rehearsal dinner venue, and throw the printed court dockets onto the imported table linens in front of Corin Dane. But I stopped myself. My hands hovered over the keyboard. Screaming would accomplish nothing. It would only allow Corinne to gracefully paint me as the hysterical, jealous, estranged older sister who was desperately trying to ruin Lila's perfect day out of pure spite. If I warned my parents right now, the Danes would simply pivot. They would create a new, elaborate lie, reassure my father, and find another dark legal loophole to exploit his desperate need for their approval. I looked at Mara. "We are not going to say a single word." Mara smiled. A slow, incredibly dangerous expression that only a seasoned courtroom litigator could muster. "We let them build the trap." "Exactly," I said, my fingers resting steadily on the keys. "We let them spend the money. We let them put on the tuxedos. We let them host the beautiful wedding. And we let them sit down at the table with the corporate investors on Monday morning." Instead of throwing a loud, emotional tantrum, I chose a much colder, infinitely more terrifying path. I began to organize the digital files. I created a secure chronological timeline. I meticulously documented the commercial lawsuits, the state business registration, the mechanics liens, and the exact timestamp of the canceled digital signature request from my father. I built a fortress of undeniable paper evidence. I was going to let them weave their brilliant, polite, high society lie all weekend long. And then, at the precise moment they believed they had completely won, I was going to burn their entire performance to the ground. While my family plunged headfirst into the chaotic, tulle-draped fever dream of the final wedding preparations, I retreated into the cold, predictable sanctuary of Crescent Harbor Title Group. I channeled every ounce of my betrayal into the meticulous review of a $60 million waterfront commercial acquisition. On a Tuesday morning, buried deep within a chain of title from 1998, I found a severed riparian right that the purchasing developer had completely missed. If the deal had closed as drafted, the new owners would have had absolutely no legal access to the water they were paying millions of dollars to overlook. My department director called me into his glass-walled office that afternoon. He closed the door, poured 2 cups of coffee, and explicitly mentioned a transition into a senior vice president role by the first quarter of the next fiscal year. He praised my surgical precision, my ability to see the invisible traps others walked blindly into. I sat in his office, nodding politely, feeling the bitter, jagged contrast tearing at my chest. In the real world, My sharp eyes and uncompromising standards were highly lucrative assets. Within the walls of my own family, those exact same qualities made me an obstacle that had to be forcibly removed. 2 evenings later, Mara arranged a meeting in a quiet, dimly lit booth at a steakhouse in downtown Richmond. She brought someone with her. Lydia Rowe was a veteran commercial real estate attorney whose reputation in the state was practically legendary. Lydia was in her late 60s, possessed a gaze like cut glass, and drank her whiskey neat. She did not deal in family drama. She dealt exclusively in property law and contract fraud. Mara gave me the broad strokes, Lydia said, setting her glass down on the polished wood. You are sitting on a trust that requires unanimous beneficiary consent for commercial development. And your family has actively excluded you from a weekend where an investor walkthrough is scheduled. The question is not whether they are trying to bypass you. The question is what specific legal mechanism we use to stop the bleeding. We laid the options out on the table like weapons in an armory. We could file a preemptive injunction, but that would require going before a judge immediately and tipping our hand before the Danes actually committed a verifiable act of fraud. We could file a contested authority notice with the county clerk, clouding the title just enough to scare off a skittish lender. Or we could prepare a formal fraud alert, specifically targeting the title insurance company that would inevitably be tasked with underwriting the Monday morning transaction. I spent the next 48 hours building an impenetrable fortress of documentation. My digital dossier grew thick and heavy. I compiled the master trust summary, highlighting the preservation clause in bright yellow. I saved timestamped screenshots of the wedding schedule detailing the Monday investor brunch. I downloaded the official state registry filings for Dane Harvest Retreat Limited Liability Company. I included the digital footprint of the canceled electronic signature request my father had aborted. I even pulled the public records of the short-term loans my parents had recently leveraged against their personal assets to fund the orchard renovations. I was not going to crash the ceremony. I had absolutely no intention of storming down the aisle in a dramatic, tear-soaked rage. Nor was I going to post a scandalous, attention-seeking manifesto on the internet for our extended relatives to gossip about. I refused to play the role of the hysterical, discarded woman. True, lasting vengeance does not live in a screaming match. It lives on paper. It lives in the undeniable, black and white ink of a legal document placed in front of a bank underwriter. My silence over the next week was not a surrender. It was a deliberate refusal to let them use my emotional reactions to gauge their own safety. One evening, when the suffocating pressure of my apartment became too much to bear, I drove my car to the very edge of the city limits. I parked on a gravel shoulder overlooking the James River. The water was dark and silent, cutting through the landscape with relentless purpose. I sat on the hood of my car, letting the cool autumn air hit my face, and finally forced myself to confront the absolute darkest truth of my situation. The deepest, most agonizing pain was not that they had stolen my inheritance or lied about a party. It was the crushing realization that my family had never actually valued my character, my loyalty, or my love. They only valued my utility. And the moment my utility, my legal signature and my silence, became a threat to their ambition, they discarded me without a single second thought. They needed my legal knowledge to clean up their messes for years. But the second that same knowledge threatened their grand illusion, they treated me like a complete stranger. Sitting by that dark river, my ultimate goal shifted permanently. I no longer cared about how to get my name put back on a guest list. I no longer cared about earning an apology from Lila or my parents. My only objective became ensuring that they could never, for the rest of their lives, pretend I did not exist. I was going to make my presence felt so deeply and so fundamentally that it would alter the trajectory of every person involved in that fraudulent deal. The next morning, I sat in Lydia's mahogany-paneled office to finalize our strategy. I handed her the completed dossier, securely bound and meticulously indexed. She flipped through the pages, her sharp eyes scanning the documents with clinical satisfaction. "This is airtight," Lydia murmured, closing the folder and folding her hands over it. If they try to push a transfer of deed, a commercial lease, or a massive refinancing loan across a table on Monday, this binder will completely vaporize their credibility. Do we file the contested authority notice now? I asked, my voice steady. Do we lock the title before the wedding even begins? Lydia leaned back in her heavy leather chair, a slow, predatory smile touching the corners of her mouth. No, she said softly. If you strike them now, they have 72 hours to invent a new lie, to claim it was all a misunderstanding, or to pivot their financing structure. You never interrupt your enemy when they are in the middle of making a fatal mistake. She tapped her index finger against the thick dossier. We wait. Let them put on the expensive dresses. Let them drink the champagne. Let them smile for the cameras and shake hands with the private equity men. The most devastating blows do not happen at the altar. They happen at the signing table, where every single one of those fake, polite smiles finally has a massive price tag attached to it. We let them sit down on Monday morning believing they have won, and then we introduce them to reality. The official week of the wedding arrived, bringing with it an oppressive, suffocating weight that settled over my apartment like a thick fog. The silence from my family had stretched on for days, a deliberate and punishing isolation designed to make me compliant. I knew the psychological game they were playing. They expected me to be entirely broken by the exclusion, desperate enough for their affection that I would do absolutely anything to be welcomed back into the fold. They made their first move on Tuesday afternoon. At exactly 4:15, my cell phone illuminated on my desk. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. I let it ring 3 times, regulating my breathing, locking away every ounce of residual grief, and preparing myself for the manipulation I knew was coming. I answered the call and placed the phone to my ear, remaining completely silent. Valeria, darling, my mother began. Her tone was unnervingly bright, brittle at the edges, sounding exactly like spun sugar that was just about to shatter under pressure. She did not ask how I was doing. She offered absolutely no apology for the sterile phone call from her wedding planner. She completely ignored the brutal reality that she had intentionally excised her eldest daughter from the most significant family event of the decade. Instead, she dove straight into a heavily rehearsed, frantic script. I know we have had a little bit of distance lately, she continued, her breathing shallow and fast. But the coordination team is absolutely hounding me about some lingering liability paperwork for the venue. It is so chaotic here. I am forwarding you a secure link right now to your personal email. It is just a simple, procedural confirmation regarding the estate insurance riders. If you could just apply your electronic signature this afternoon, it would save me such a massive headache. We are just so overwhelmed. Val. I stared at the blank wall of my office. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her request almost made me laugh. She had banished me from the premises, hired security guards to ensure I could not step foot on the property, and was now casually asking me to sign away my legal rights under the guise of helping her manage her wedding stress. I am not signing a standalone digital page. Mom, I replied, my voice devoid of any warmth or familial affection. Send me the entire document package. I need to review the master file, the specific addendums, and the terms of agreement before I authorize anything. The bright, brittle facade vanished instantly. The silence on the line was heavy and toxic. When she finally spoke again, her voice cracked, immediately deploying the weapon she had used to control my father for 30 years, tears. Why are you doing this? Valeria, she sobbed, the manufactured panic rising in her throat. Why are you constantly making things so impossibly difficult? Your sister is getting married in 4 days. I am barely holding everything together. And you are acting like a cold, suspicious stranger. You are complicating things at the absolute worst possible time. Just sign the document. I am not the one who made me a stranger, I stated flatly, refusing to absorb her projected guilt. Send the full file, or do not call me again. I disconnected the line. My hands were shaking, not from sorrow, but from a profound, radiant anger. They were trying to blindfold me while asking me to hand them the knife. The psychological siege continued late Thursday night. It was approaching midnight when my phone buzzed against my nightstand. This time, it was Lila. I answered, and her voice immediately filled the dark room. It was a fragile, trembling whisper, meticulously engineered to elicit my deeply ingrained protective instincts. "Val, please," Lila begged, her breath hitching dramatically. "I am drowning under the pressure here. Corinne is driving me completely insane with the seating arrangements, and Everett is constantly in meetings. I just need you to log in and sign that one form Mom sent. The legal team says it is holding up the final vendor payments. Please, just help me get through this weekend. Once the wedding is over and the dust settles, I promise we will sit down and talk about everything. Just help me." I closed my eyes in the dark. That single plea laid bare the absolute, devastating truth of my sister's character. She was not a helpless victim of the Dane family's corporate maneuvering. She knew exactly what that signature meant. She knew they were trading our grandmother's legacy for her lavish lifestyle, even knowing she was treating me with unprecedented cruelty. Lila still prioritized the aesthetic perfection of her wedding weekend over the truth. She wanted me to quietly hand over my inheritance, stay hidden in the shadows, and allow her to play the beautiful bride without any inconvenient consequences. "We will talk about everything later," was the ultimate, selfish lie. Once Monday morning passed, there would be absolutely nothing left to talk about. "I cannot help you, Lila," I said quietly, and I hung up the phone. By Friday morning, the atmosphere had escalated from emotional manipulation to concrete, terrifying reality. Reed, my young cousin working on the videography crew, sent me a frantic text message containing a single, high-resolution photograph. He had sneaked into the main dining hall of the rehearsal dinner venue and taken a picture of the master's seating chart. I zoomed in on the image, my blood running cold as I read the names printed on the pristine white placards. The Hollister extended family was banished to the far perimeter of the room, seated near the kitchen doors. The prime real estate, the large circular tables positioned directly adjacent to the bride and groom, was completely devoid of family members. Instead, there was an entire table designated for private wealth managers. Another table was blocked off entirely for commercial land use consultants. And two massive tables, seated right at the front, were reserved exclusively for senior executives from Dane Lantern Hospitality. It was a hostile corporate takeover disguised as a rehearsal dinner. 10 minutes later, I opened my social media applications. Everett maintained a highly curated, professional profile. He posted a temporary story, a beautiful golden hour photograph of my grandmother's apple orchard, the trees heavy with autumn fruit. I took a screenshot the second it appeared. 3 minutes later, the post was hastily deleted, likely because Corinne realized it revealed too much too soon. But I had the image. And more importantly, I had captured the arrogant, boastful caption Everett had typed across the bottom of the screen. "The future of Hollister Ridge begins Monday." Hollister Ridge. They had not even waited for the legal ink to dry before completely erasing our family's heritage and rebranding the property for their luxury portfolio. I immediately called Lydia Rowe. She answered on the second ring. I relayed the details of the phone calls, the desperate demands for a blind digital signature, the corporate seating chart, and the deleted social media post confirming the Monday morning launch. "They are incredibly desperate," Lydia assessed, her voice a low, steady rumble of authority. "They failed to secure your legitimate consent through emotional blackmail, which means they are now backed into a corner. When they sit down with the private equity lenders on Monday, they have two choices. They either present a forged document bearing your copied signature, or they intentionally conceal the trust's unanimous consent requirement entirely, attempting to pass title with only your sister's authorization. Can we stop the wire transfers if they do that?" I asked, pacing the length of my living room. "Absolutely," Lydia confirmed. if they use falsified documents or deliberately misrepresent their legal authority to encumber that land. It instantly upgrades from an ugly family dispute to federal bank fraud. Your dispute notice is fully drafted and finalized. I have the direct contact information for the title underwriting team and the primary lender. The second they attempt to execute that transaction on Monday, we drop the hammer. We freeze the title, we freeze the funds, and we completely blow up their leverage. I spent the rest of Friday afternoon organizing my desk. I printed out the screenshot of Everett's deleted post and added it to the thick legal binder Lydia and I had assembled. I reviewed every single piece of evidence, ensuring the timeline of their deceit is flawlessly documented. I was no longer a grieving daughter or an abandoned sister. I was a title risk analyst about to dismantle a fraudulent multi-million-dollar acquisition. As the sun began to set over Richmond, casting long, dark shadows across my apartment floor, the bitter, agonizing paradox of the entire situation finally settled into my bones. My family had treated me like a complete disposable stranger. They had systematically deleted my name from the guest list, barred me from the hotel, and hired men with earpieces to ensure I stayed far away from the celebration. They found my presence utterly repulsive. Yet, in order for their grand, social climbing transaction to actually survive, they desperately needed me to play the role of the obedient, passive victim. They needed the stranger they had just exiled to quietly bankroll their new, elite existence. They wanted to erase my voice while stealing my authority. They thought they had succeeded. They thought I was sitting alone, crying over a dress I would never wear. But they were about to learn that removing me from the guest list was the most catastrophic mistake they could have possibly made. The knock on my apartment door came at exactly 9 o'clock on Friday night. It was a heavy, irregular sound, lacking the confident rhythm of a casual visitor. The rehearsal dinner up in Charlottesville had likely concluded 2 hours ago, meaning whoever was on the other side of that door had driven over 60 miles through the dark immediately after the dessert plates were cleared. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. My father stood in the dimly lit hallway. If I had not known him my entire life, I might have mistaken him for a stranger. The polished, effortless veneer of the Southern patriarch had completely evaporated. His tailored suit jacket was severely wrinkled, hanging loosely off his shoulders as if he had recently lost a significant amount of weight. His face was drawn and haggard, his skin carrying a gray, sickly pallor under the fluorescent hallway lights. The deep lines around his mouth were etched with profound, undeniable panic. He looked exactly like a man who had finally realized the sheer depth of the water he was drowning in. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice rough and incredibly tired. I stepped aside, leaving enough space for him to pass. I did not offer to take his coat. I did not offer him a glass of water. I simply closed the door and followed him into the living room, standing rigidly near the kitchen island while he collapsed onto the edge of my sofa. He stared at his hands for a long time. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with the ghosts of everything that had transpired over the past week. I waited. I was fully prepared to listen to whatever manufactured excuse he had driven all this way to deliver. "The Danes are accelerating the timeline," he finally said, not looking up at me. His voice shook slightly. "Everett pulled me into a private room after the dinner tonight. He said their primary lenders are getting incredibly anxious about the market rates if the land transfer agreement is delayed past Monday morning. Everett says he might have to pull back on his initial capital investment commitments." He looked up then, and the sheer terror in his eyes was visceral. "Valeria, your mother and I opened massive lines of credit. We put second mortgages on our own assets to fund these orchard renovations, because Richard Dane assured me it was merely a bridge loan until the corporate funding cleared. We owe hundreds of thousands of dollars to private contractors. If Everett walks away from the financial commitments after the wedding, we will be completely ruined. We will lose the house. We will lose everything." I stood perfectly still, absorbing the sheer magnitude of his confession. The trap had closed exactly as Lydia and Mara had predicted. The Danes had manipulated my father's vanity and class anxiety, encouraged him to overextend himself financially, and were now using that very debt as a weapon to force the immediate surrender of our family's generational land. I looked at the man who had raised me. I waited for the pivot. I waited for the moment of profound clarity where a father realizes he has traded his eldest child for a lie. I waited for him to say he was deeply sorry for allowing those people to banish me from the property. I waited for him to apologize for treating me like a disposable liability. Instead, he took a deep, shuddering breath, looked directly into my eyes, and asked the only question he actually cared about. "Valeria, can you please just sign the authorization so everything can go smoothly?" The question hung in the quiet air of my apartment. It did not merely break my heart. It systematically pulverized whatever fragile remnants of hope I had left for our relationship. Even now, standing at the absolute precipice of financial ruin, on the darkest, most humiliating night of his life, he had not come to my home to reclaim his daughter. He had come to secure a solution. He was still prioritizing the illusion of the Dane family wealth over the fundamental reality of my humanity. I was not a person to him. I was a signature. "No," I said. My voice was incredibly soft, yet it seemed to echo off the walls. His face crumbled. "Valeria, please, you do not understand what is at stake." "I understand exactly what is at stake, Dad," I replied, walking over to my desk. "I understand it far better than you do, because I actually read the documents." I picked up a single, crisp sheet of paper from my desk. I had drafted it with Lydia that very afternoon, anticipating that someone from the family would eventually panic and try to force my hand before the weekend was over. I walked back and placed the paper face up on the coffee table directly in front of him. "I will not sign their waiver," I stated, my tone shifting into the cold, clinical cadence I used in hostile boardrooms. "But I will offer you a path out of the trap you walked into. I have laid out 5 non-negotiable conditions. If you meet them, I will step in and help you untangle this catastrophic mess." Graham leaned forward, his hands trembling as he picked up the paper. "Condition 1, I dictated, not needing to read the text. "You will immediately halt any and all transfers of title, deed, or zoning rights regarding Hollister Orchard House. Condition 2, you will hire independent legal counsel for yourself, for Mom, and for Lila. The attorneys must be sourced outside of the Dane family network, and you will pay their retainers yourself. Condition 3, you will submit to a full, independent forensic audit of every single debt incurred for this wedding and the property renovations." He swallowed hard, his eyes scanning the aggressive legal language I had constructed. "Condition 4, I continued, my voice growing colder. "You will immediately contact the title company and withdraw any document, email, or digital file that bears my forged, copied, or coerced signature. And Condition 5, you will provide me with a formal, signed written admission stating that you intentionally removed me from the wedding guest list to conceal a commercial real estate transaction from a legal beneficiary." Graham stopped reading. He slowly lowered the paper to his lap. The silence returned, thicker and more suffocating than before. He looked at the document, and then he looked at me. I could see the exact moment the battle was lost. He saw the cold, undeniable truth of his own cowardice written in black and white, and he simply could not bear the weight of it. "I cannot do this, Valeria," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I cannot blow up Lila's wedding day. We are simply too deep into this. The guests are already at the hotels. The vendors are paid. If I demand independent lawyers and halt the transfer tomorrow morning, the Danes will cancel the entire event. Lila would never forgive me. The humiliation would destroy your mother." "You are not blowing up a wedding," I replied, feeling a strange, hollow calmness settling over my chest. The wedding was turned into a corporate business tool long before I ever said a single word. They weaponized Lila's marriage to steal our land, and you let them do it so you could feel like you belonged in their country club. I am not ruining anything. Dad, I am simply the first person willing to look directly at the truth." He closed his eyes. A single tear escaped, cutting a path down his weathered cheek, but it was a tear of self-pity, not of remorse. He placed the unsigned document gently back onto the coffee table. He stood up slowly, the joints in his knees popping in the quiet room. He did not argue further. He did not yell. He simply accepted that he could not manipulate me. And because he could not use me, he had absolutely no further use for my company. He walked to the front door, his head bowed, his shoulders defeated. He stepped out into the hallway. "I am sorry, Valeria," he murmured to the floor. He pulled the door shut behind him. It did not slam. It closed with a soft, polite click that somehow felt infinitely more violent than a shattered window. The finality of that quiet sound struck me with physical force, a brutal confirmation that I was entirely, fundamentally alone. I walked back into the living room and sat down at the small dining table. I looked at the unsigned piece of paper resting on the glass surface. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, officially crossing over into the day of the wedding. I did not shed a single tear. The deep, agonizing reservoir of grief I had carried for the past week had finally run completely dry, leaving behind nothing but cold, hardened steel. I sat at that table as the hours crawled by, watching the dark sky outside my window slowly turn to a bruised purple. I was no longer waiting for an apology. I was no longer hoping for a sudden miraculous revelation from my family. I was simply preparing for Monday morning, sitting in the quiet dark, like a woman who had finally accepted that the only way to survive a burning house was to be the one holding the matches. Saturday morning broke over Richmond with a crisp, biting chill. On the day my only sister was to be married. My apartment was completely silent. I did not put on the lavender silk dress that had been chosen for me months ago. I did not pace the floor. I did not draft an emotional, passive-aggressive status update for my social media networks. I simply made a single cup of black coffee, sat on my balcony, and watched the city wake up. My family had expected me to fight, to scream, or to dramatically beg for re-entry into their inner circle. By doing absolutely nothing, I allowed my physical absence to become a massive, unexplainable void that no amount of expensive floral arrangements could cover. At 10:30 in the morning, my phone vibrated with a text message from Reed. He was stationed near the entrance of the grand estate, filming the arriving guests. "The whispering has officially started," Reed wrote. "Aunt Martha asked Corinne where you were. Corinne put on this incredibly fake, tragic face and said you were dealing with a sudden, catastrophic corporate emergency at your title firm. She said you were devastated to miss it. Nobody believes her. The excuse is way too polished." I set the phone down. A work emergency. It was the only lie Corinne could tell that would not immediately incriminate my parents. But a sister does not miss a wedding for a desk job, and my extended family, though polite, was not stupid. The tension was already bleeding into the champagne hour. Throughout the early afternoon, Reed fed me a steady stream of covert updates from the front lines. He described a wedding that looked absolutely flawless through a camera lens, but felt entirely suffocating in person. Lila walked down the aisle looking like a vision in imported French lace. But Reed noticed her hands were shaking so violently that her bouquet trembled. She was moving through her own wedding day like a ghost lost in a thick fog. The beautiful dress, the meticulously curated aesthetic, the perfectly timed string quartet. It was all completely overshadowed by a deeply rooted panic she did not dare vocalize. She knew the clock was ticking down to Monday morning. Everett, conversely, was entirely relaxed. He did not look like a man overwhelmed by the profound emotion of taking a wife. He looked exactly like a corporate raider who had just successfully executed a hostile takeover. During the cocktail reception, Reed observed Everett repeatedly abandoning Lila to stand near the high-top tables reserved for the bankers and the land-use consultants. He was shaking hands, aggressively patting backs, and discussing zoning permits while his bride stood awkwardly with her bridesmaids. Several of our older relatives began exchanging sharp, uncomfortable glances. The Hollister side of the family was unraveling in real time. Elise, my mother, was captured in the background of dozens of photographs with a frozen, terrified smile plastered across her face. Reed said she kept abandoning her assigned table, practically running out to the secluded garden paths to make frantic, hushed phone calls. Graham was even worse. My father sat at the head table, his skin gray and entirely drained of blood. He did not touch a single bite of the 5-course meal. He just stared blankly at his water glass, the crushing weight of the unsigned document I had shown him the night before pressing down on his chest. While they performed their tragic, gilded play, I drove across town to Mara's townhouse. Lydia Rowe was stationed at her downtown office, preparing to execute the final, lethal blow. We had coordinated the timing perfectly. We waited until 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the exact moment the officiant pronounced Lila and Everett husband and wife, to launch the legal strike. Sitting at Mara's heavy wooden dining table, I watched my screen as Lydia formally submitted the massive legal package. She filed the Notice of Contested Authority directly with the county clerk. She transmitted the comprehensive fraud concern dossier via Secure, certified digital courier to the primary lending institution financing Everett's company. Finally, she sent the demand for status quo to the senior underwriting team at the title insurance agency handling the Monday closing. The trap was officially sprung. The rest of the afternoon was an agonizing exercise in pure endurance. Mara and I sat in her living room in near total silence. We did not turn on the television. We did not play music. We just sat there with mugs of coffee that had gone completely cold hours ago, staring at the inbox on my laptop. Waiting for the confirmation from the title company felt exactly like standing on a shoreline, watching the dark, swirling clouds of a massive hurricane gathering on the horizon. We knew the storm was going to make landfall. We just did not know exactly how much damage the initial impact would cause. Hours bled into one another. The sky outside Mara's window turned from a bright, crisp blue to a bruised, heavy purple, and finally faded into complete darkness. Back at the estate, the lavish reception was shifting into its final, most celebratory phase. Then, at exactly 8:45 in the evening, the screen illuminated with a new notification. It was an encrypted email from Lydia. The subject line contained only 2 words. It read, "Underwriter response." I clicked the message open, my heart hammering a brutal, frantic rhythm against my ribs. Lydia had forwarded a direct communication from the senior vice president of the title insurance firm. The message was brief, dense with legal terminology, and absolutely devastating to the Dane family's master plan. Upon review of the submitted contested authority documentation and the highlighted trust preservation clause, the email read, "We have officially flagged this file for severe title defects and potential misrepresentation of signatory authority. We are issuing an immediate hard stop on all related policies. We will not proceed to disbursement or closing on Monday morning until a full, independent legal review is conducted and valid. Notarized consent is obtained from all named beneficiaries." I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for an entire week. "They flagged it," I whispered, turning the laptop so Mara could read the screen. "The bank will see the flag by tomorrow morning. The money is frozen. The transaction is completely dead." Mara leaned back in her chair, a slow, fiercely satisfied smile spreading across her face. Checkmate. I closed the laptop and walked over to the large bay window in Mara's living room. Looking out at the quiet, dark street, a profound, contrasting image filled my mind. Right at this very second, 50 miles away, the grand reception was reaching its peak. I could picture the scene perfectly. The heavy velvet curtains, the towering centerpieces of white orchids, the impeccably dressed waiters pouring endless streams of expensive champagne. I could see Lila and Everett stepping onto the polished mahogany dance floor for their first dance as husband and wife. The band was playing a slow, romantic melody. The perfect, warm yellow string lights were casting a magical, golden glow over the entire room, making everyone look beautiful, successful, and entirely untouchable. They were spinning under the lights, completely oblivious to the reality that their grand illusion was already over. They had built an entire future on a foundation of lies, stolen signatures, and polite betrayals. But while they danced in their expensive clothes, believing they had successfully outsmarted me and secured their fortune, the invisible spark had already caught, deep within the servers of the title company and the corporate bank. The paperwork was actively burning. The explosive charge had been planted exactly where it belonged, and the fuse was burning straight toward Monday morning. Monday morning arrived with brilliant mocking sunshine. The investor brunch was not held in a sterile corporate boardroom. It was staged in the breathtaking, glass-walled solarium of the wedding venue, serving as a final, arrogant display of manufactured wealth. The room smelled of expensive espresso, fresh orchids, and victory through the glass panes. I watched the scene unfold before I entered. Everett and Corinne Dane stood at the head of a long, polished mahogany table, holding crystal flutes of morning champagne. They were surrounded by 3 senior private equity investors, a commercial land use consultant, and the lead underwriter from the title insurance company. My parents sat near the center of the table. My father looked utterly exhausted but profoundly relieved. His shoulders slumped as if a massive physical weight had finally been lifted. Lila sat beside Everett, wearing a casual but flawlessly tailored white silk dress, smiling softly at the bankers. They had survived the weekend. The beautiful illusion had held together just long enough. At the center of the table rested a thick stack of finalized contracts and a silver pen. They truly believed the hardest part was over. At exactly 9:15 in the morning, I pushed the heavy mahogany doors open. I did not wear a floral dress. I wore a sharply tailored, dark charcoal suit. Beside me walked Lydia Rowe, her posture radiating the terrifying, absolute authority of a veteran litigator holding a flawless hand of cards. The conversation in the solarium died instantly. The clinking of silver forks against porcelain stopped so abruptly it left a ringing silence in the air. My mother dropped her linen napkin. The blood drained entirely from my father's face, leaving him looking like a hollowed-out ghost. Corinne Dane's triumphant smile froze, fracturing into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic as she realized the exact person they had spent the entire weekend desperately trying to erase had never actually left the game. "Good morning," I said, my voice steady, carrying clearly across the quiet room. Lydia did not bother with pleasantries. She walked directly to the table, opened her heavy leather briefcase, and dropped 3 thickly bound legal dossiers directly in front of the private equity investors and the title underwriter. The sound of the heavy binders hitting the wood echoed like a gunshot. "I am Lydia Rowe, independent legal counsel representing Valeria Hollister," Lydia announced, her voice a sharp, commanding bark that demanded absolute attention. "Before a single signature is affixed to those transfer documents, I am formally advising the lending institution and the title agency that the underlying asset, Hollister Orchard House, is currently under a contested authority hold." The lead private equity investor frowned, looking down at the dossier. "Contested authority. We were assured by the Dane family that this was a single-party transaction fully authorized by the current trust beneficiaries." "You were lied to," Lydia replied smoothly. "If you turn to page 4 of my dossier, you will see the Master Trust Preservation Clause. It explicitly mandates the legally sound, notarized consent of both living beneficiaries for any commercial redevelopment, refinancing, or transfer of deed. My client has not consented. Furthermore, we have reason to believe the Dane family is in possession of an unsecured digital file containing my client's old signature. Let the record show that any document presented at this table today claiming to bear Valeria Hollister's authorization is a forged, fraudulent instrument." The title underwriter immediately pulled his hands away from the stack of contracts as if the paper had suddenly caught fire. He looked directly at Everett. "Is this true? Is there a secondary beneficiary who has not signed off on the collateral?" Everett's jaw tightened. "It is a minor family misunderstanding. We are resolving it internally." "You are not resolving anything," I interjected. stepping forward. I looked directly at the investors. My family deliberately removed me from the wedding guest list this weekend, revoked my hotel access, and hired security to keep me off the premises specifically to conceal this morning's transaction from me. They attempted to sell my inheritance behind my back. This is outrageous, Corinne snapped, stepping forward, her face flushing with sudden, ugly anger. We are trying to save your family from total financial ruin. Valeria, you are making a terrible mistake. You are not saving anyone. Corinne, Lydia countered, pulling the second set of documents from her briefcase and sliding them across the table. And that brings us to the second matter. Duty to disclose. Lydia looked at the bankers. You are about to underwrite a massive commercial loan based on the operational strength of Dane Lantern Hospitality. I suggest you read the public court filings in that second folder. The Dane family is currently fighting 2 active commercial lawsuits for breach of contract. They have 3 unresolved mechanics liens filed by major construction firms due to severe non-payment. Their flagship property is currently facing a summary judgment. They are not acquiring the Hollister land to expand a thriving empire. They are desperately trying to steal an unencumbered asset to use as a life raft for a sinking ship. The solarium erupted into chaotic murmurs. The lead investor flipped frantically through the printed court dockets, his face darkening with furious realization. I turned my attention to my sister. Lila was sitting completely frozen, her eyes wide with terror as the fairy tale violently crumbled around her. I picked up a glossy, professionally bound booklet from the table. It was the master pitch deck Everett had prepared for the investors. I opened it to page 12 and slid it precisely in front of Lila. Read it, Lila, I commanded quietly. She looked down. The page featured a beautiful photograph of her, labeling her as the elegant hostess and founder of the new luxury retreat. But directly beneath the photograph was the corporate capitalization table and the structural vesting schedule. You are the face of the brand for exactly 12 months, I explained, forcing her to look at the undeniable mathematics. After the first year, the corporate structure dictates that 90% of the voting shares and total executive control revert exclusively to Everett's holding company. You do not own anything. You are just a pretty prop they included in the presentation package to make the hostile takeover look like a family business. Lila gasped, pressing her hand over her mouth. She looked up at Everett, her eyes pleading for a denial. But Everett would not even look at her. He was too busy furiously whispering to his mother. The lead investor slammed his folder shut. He looked across the table at my father. Graham, did you know about this trust clause? Did you deliberately exclude a legal beneficiary to push this loan through? The entire room turned to look at my father. Graham Hollister, the man who had traded his pride for an invitation to a country club, completely broke. He sank lower in his chair, unable to meet the eyes of the wealthy men he had so desperately wanted to impress. We knew she would not sign it, Graham confessed, his voice a pathetic, broken whisper. We needed the money to cover the wedding debts. Everett said if we just pushed the paperwork through today, Valeria would eventually calm down. Next to him, my mother began to sob hysterically. You have always been the strong one, Valeria, she cried, hiding her face in her hands. You always handle the hard things. We just assumed you would absorb this and let us have a better life. Why could you not just let us have this? The sheer toxicity of her confession hung in the air. But it did not hurt me anymore. It simply validated everything I had realized sitting by the river. Because my identity is not the price of your admission into high society, I answered coldly. The lead investor stood up. He did not yell. He simply buttoned his suit jacket. We are done here. We do not underwrite contested titles, and we certainly do not fund active fraud. The other bankers and the title agent immediately followed suit. They packed their briefcases, completely ignoring Corinne's frantic, desperate attempts to block the doorway and explain the situation. Within 2 minutes, the private equity team had walked out of the solarium, taking the millions of dollars and the Dane family's entire future with them. Once the luxurious paint was stripped away, No one wanted anything to do with a transaction that smelled of desperation and felony fraud. The room was left in suffocating silence, occupied only by the wreckage of two families. I looked down at my parents. I did not scream. I did not revel in their humiliation. I delivered my final terms with the absolute precision of a risk analyst closing a file. I am executing my legal right to permanently block the commercial sale of the orchard, I stated. I am forcing this entire estate into an independent financial audit. You will restructure your personal debt transparently, and I will only assist you within the strict confines of a binding legal framework. I will not blindly rescue you. I will not cover your tracks. And I will never, ever allow you to sacrifice my name for your vanity again. I turned and walked toward the door with Lydia. They had deleted me from the guest list like a total stranger because they thought it would make it easier to sell my future behind my back. But it was that exact stranger who ended up being the only person awake enough to stop them from being sold out to the tune of their own wedding music. I had not begged for a seat at their elaborate, fraudulent banquet. I had chosen my own position, and I had forced the entire room to look directly at the truth. Thank you for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are listening from. So please drop a comment below so we can interact and share our thoughts on this situation. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel. Like this video, and hype it up so this story can be heard by even more people.